Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. And we have a real treat for you this episode. Joining me again after a long hiatus. He was one of the first guests that I had on the show, which
That's right.
made me consider this podcast off to a great start. I think it was in the early days of the show when I still had co-hosts, maybe even. I don't know.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
either way, Jay, it's a pleasure to have you back on the show. We're going to be talking a little bit about the recent passing of David Lynch and, of course, his legacy, a tremendous film legacy. I feel kind of funny, I have to admit, when we first spoke, I was like, oh, I don't watch movies. Well, being a full-time podcaster now, I have a little bit more time on my hands, and I've spent plenty of time watching David Lynch, and Twin Peaks actually was one of my favorite shows I used to watch when I was younger. But either way, this topic is something I'm a little bit more acquainted with. But before we dive into David Lynch, tell the audience a little bit about your next book, because you're working on the follow-up to your what will be a trilogy, Esoteric Hollywood, and on Danny's Low Value Mail podcast, which you're so kind to join us this past week. You mentioned how Hollywood is dying. So I have to ask, do you think this will be the last Esoteric Hollywood book, considering we have maybe only a corpse of Hollywood left after this decade?
You actually kind of read my mind, and thanks for having me back. Because I was actually thinking like a couple days ago, like, is this going to be the last of the Hollywood books? Will I do another one? I mean, I guess you could always go back and write about, old movies, which is kind of what we already do here on my end. But yeah, man, I mean, that was exactly what I was thinking. It may be the end of Hollywood as we know it. Everything's going to streaming and Apple Studios and Amazon Studios and all that. So yeah, could be. I may. What I like to do is kind of step away from projects and then come back after a long time. So I might finish part 3, come back after a few years, and maybe, like, I was thinking a separate book on all the people in Hollywood that were spies. That could be its own book. I don't know if anybody has written a specific book on that,
That would be
but
fascinating.
fair question.
Yeah, that would be fascinating. I think it's been alluded to in several movies, just the tight knit. And I mean, obviously the documents have come out. But as far as, new movies go, were there many new movies that made the cut for this third book?
Good question. I'm looking through the list of the ones that I included.
Because
Yeah, there's a few.
I can say one movie that really, I don't know critically how well it did, but I remember a lot of people, at least in our sphere, talking about it, was something, what was it called? Everything, Everywhere, All at Once, something to that effect, right? And that was kind of
Oh
like
yeah, I actually haven't seen that. I remember when that came out, maybe last year, and everybody was talking about that, but I actually forgot to see it. Um, I mean, there's a few that are maybe films within the last, say, 5 years that made the cut, like Under the Silver Lake. That was a really esoteric film. I think that one's going to be in there. I got analysis maybe of Babylon Berlin, which is a pretty popular German TV show. That'll be mentioned. And then there's going to be a final kind of culminating chapter called like Hollywood Apocalypse, which is really just um, overall all of the Hollywood treatments of like Antichrist and end times and how Hollywood presents that. So there's a few in there that are new, like the Omen prequel was I thought it was a pretty good movie. But yeah, not too many new movies.
Yeah, I had that suspicion that that would be the case, and yeah, you sort of addressed that right off the bat. So, Jay, it's a pleasure to have you back. Thanks for joining me. There's a lot we have to talk about as it pertains to David Lynch, but you just mentioned something that I want to maybe tangent to really quickly. Babylon Berlin. This is a interesting show. I've never heard of it, but it does kind of connect to what we might talk about today, in the sense that, oh well, at least for me, I read a book called The Beast of Berlin. I believe it was by Oh, geez, he writes so many books about Aleister Crowley. He's like the foremost Aleister Crowley author. But either way, um, he wrote a book about Aleister Crowley's time in Berlin, and the more I've researched, the more it comes back to Berlin. Even Skull and Bones. I mean, they allegedly have some sort of mysterious brother chapter that was from
That's correct.
Berlin. So
Yeah.
it's a strange place, and it seems like maybe the veil's lifting on this to some sense. Like, do the German people, are they kind of, is this indicative that they're kind of interested in the occult and in a kind of similar way to the way America, we're kind of taking in these ideas in a more, common way?
Well, after World War II, the OSS and the CIA were involved in re-education projects in Germany. And the idea was that Germany would have to kind of be punished and re-educated as a result of what happened in World War II. And so the US actually tried out a lot of psychological warfare, social engineering techniques to make sure that the Germans would not be involved in engineering or anything like that. They were supposed to be more, uh, I guess, domesticated. That's covered it in depth in the Johann Ratio book on the Milner Fabian conspiracy, which is a really good book. So I think that they kind of try to Americanize Europe and Germany after World War II, and part of that would be to push a lot of what the CIA has pushed in Germany, like experimental family situations, PEDO type of stuff, that's been literally pushed by the CIA in Germany. So, um, yeah, I think they are subject to the same toxic degeneracy in terms of culture. Probably Crowley was there. I'm just going from memory. I'm not an expert on Crowley, but uh, well, he wanted to join OTO, and so you have Theodore Royce and Karl Kellner were, were in Germany. So I'm assuming that's why Crowley went there. But Crowley was also working for British intelligence, so he might have had, intelligence jobs he was supposed to do or something as well. But yes, there is a dark, deep seated connection with German paganism, Germanic traditions that I think kind of are there. German films were doing a lot of satanic expressionism before Hollywood. So you had this in Nosferatu. You had, I think, The Golem was a German film too, which is about Kabbalah, obviously. And you had Fritz Lang's Metropolis and so forth. That's before Hollywood was really doing much of the satanic in cinema. But yeah, I would say there's probably a lot of that bubbling underneath the surface. And to mention Babylon Berlin, that actually comes up in season 2. There's a whole section of season 2. Season 1, I don't want to spoil it, but it's actually about compromising politicians with S.E.E.X stuff, which is odd because that was coming out around the same time as like the Jeff Stein McEffery stuff. Season 2 deals with a bunch of actors and actresses that are involved in a satanic cult in the German film production business. And then it kind of hints at like transhumanists, Carl Jung, CIA mind control stuff towards the end. So
Fascinating. Yeah, I should check that out. That's interesting. It
it's
seems
a pretty good show, I have to admit.
it seems like this is, part of a list of shows that have kind of become popular in this atmosphere of dead Hollywood. I think Stranger Things might be another example, or Black Mirror could be another
Mm-hmm.
example
Yes,
where,
Black Mirror is in the book, by the way.
okay, interesting.
Yeah.
And would you say that these shows are inspired by Lynch to some degree? I mean, he's obviously a prolific director, and everyone knows who he is. But do you see any of Lynch's work in some of the newer stuff you've looked at?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it's all over the place. I remember watching a pretty good independent horror film called Come True. I feel like it was very Lynchian in its influence. Um, Stranger Things, maybe. I hadn't thought about that off the top of my head. I mean, there was a lot of like, I mean, the in between. That's kind of like the other place in Twin Peaks. So yeah, maybe that was there. I just didn't notice it. Um, we've seen a lot of independent horror films over the last couple of years, and I would imagine quite a few of them have that kind of influence. I'm just not. I can't think of anything off the top of my head that stands out other than something like Come True. There's a new independent horror film I just saw the other day, and I watched the trailer. I've got it on my Amazon list, but I don't even remember the name of it. But it looked just like a David Lynch film. So I would say absolutely. I'm sure that Blue Velvet, Twin Peaks, Mulholland Drive. I think these films are going to be influencing people for years to come.
Yeah. Yeah, there is an aspect to them, and you write about this. You've written about Lynch's work in both Esoteric Hollywood 1 and 2, and you've also done a pretty comprehensive breakdown of Lynch's work on your YouTube channel recently. So I recommend folks check that out as a addition to today's conversation. But as it comes to the whole Lynchian world of things, you reference it being sort of like a hallucinogenic experience, or maybe people who have had hallucinogens, experiences with them to some extent, may see into his work in a way that others who haven't cannot. I can attest to this to some extent, but I'll also say that all of my and I'm not watching these films, studying them, but all of my, attempts to recount a Lynch film end up spawning a dream sequence that, upon further, investigation, I'm like, oh, that wasn't even a part of the film. So there's a part of his media that works its way into your psyche. I can at least attest to that. But yeah, describe that, and is this a part of something that inspired you to initially write this series? I mean, was Lynch's work particularly inspirational to you in general?
Yeah, I think for one, because I grew up with a lot of buddies that were, film buffs. We loved movies, we loved the arts in general. And I think we didn't understand in the 90s when we were watching this stuff what it meant. And that doesn't mean that I've understood it all. I'm not trying to overanalyze it and make it like it's some sort of giant puzzle that I put all the pieces together. But I do think in the case of like Twin Peaks, for example, I did put a lot of the puzzle pieces for that together. I'd say about 8 or 9 years ago, I went through all of Twin Peaks kind of in anticipation for season 3 that was coming. I don't think we even knew at the time it was coming, but it ended up working out that way. And I took, copious notes, paid a lot of attention. I was actually reading a lot of text that went along with it. Not intentionally, but I was reading like Carl Jung and Mircea Eliade and him talking about shamanism. And then I remember watching Lost Highway, and I felt like, okay, so some of this is kind of starting to make sense. And I think there's elements of dissociation going on here. And I remember reading Sinister Forces trilogy, and he talked about how there's these shamanic elements to Lynch. And I think that was a big key that I never thought about before. Through the darkness the future's past, the magician longs to see one chance out between two worlds, fire walk with me. That's a shamanic kind of magician's phrase, or almost kind of a haiku, you could say. But reading about tantrism and reading about tulpas, you have Coop in the story is he's interested in Tibetan Buddhism. So some of these keys, I think, helped me to kind of piece together what was going on. And then you get the one-armed man, Mike or Gerard, who talks about this magical ring that the people in the society wear. That, I think, was another key, that when I saw sigils, magic sigils in the background of several scenes, that was kind of a key for me, that, okay, so there's like an esoteric component to this where they're using the keys of Solomon. They're trying to, access the dark dimensions and whatnot. So to me, it just suggested Crowleyan type of stuff. And when Mark Frost put out his book in 17, 18, somewhere in there, about the secret history of Twin Peaks, it was all in there. Like, he talked about Crowley, Jack Parsons, magic rings, sex magic, mystical toponymy. I mean, it was all pretty much what I had laid out in my analysis I'd written a few years before his book came out. So to me, that was a vindication of the reading that I had of the film, or excuse me, of the TV series. And then we had season 3 come out, and I had to put that in the book, and I combined that with Fire Walk with Me. So Long story short, yeah, I think understanding some of the elements of the shamanic traditions, the magical ritual magic traditions, Crowley, all of that helped me to look back on this series that I didn't understand in the 90s and decode it. And then by extension, some of those same themes appear in other mysterious films like Lost Highway or Mulholland Drive.
Yeah. Yeah, Lost Highway left a similar feeling, and I also have seen Blue Velvet. I watched the entire Twin Peaks series, and I watched Firewalks with Me twice because I was so disturbed by it. I didn't really understand, some of the, I guess, more subtle aspects of it. But there's a major theme, and maybe I might be conflating the film with the television show. So correct me where I'm wrong. And I haven't seen the new, version of Twin Peaks. But there's a thread of sex trafficking going on
Yeah, and the same with Inland Empire too. Yeah,
right, and because of the geographical location of this fictional place, they're sort of on the border of Canada, right? And
right.
Laura Palmer is sort of whisked into this world of
Right.
drug use and prostitution, and in at a very young age. And at first, you're kind of like, wow, how could this young woman who's supposed to be this symbol of American innocence, almost like
Yeah,
a
she's like the
virgin,
prom queen, exactly.
right? So help me understand this a little bit better. Like, what is David Lynch, do you think, trying to tell us? Is there sort of indulgence in this that you think he's maybe complicit in, or is this more of him kind of just giving us a raw look at what America's underbelly looks like?
Yeah, I think it's the latter for sure. I don't have any knowledge or evidence of him necessarily involved in anything malicious per se. I mean, I just think he was coming from that vantage point with Blue Velvet. Same theme, 100% in Twin Peaks. A lot of the same spirit, a lot of the same vibe going on between those two productions. But I think that the key here is that you have Laura's dad as the real villain here, because at some point that we learn from Fire Walk with Me, Leland had been seeing these prostitutes, one of whom looks similar to Laura Palmer, and Leland had been molesting her. And we also find out that Leland seems to be possessed himself. He has alternate personalities. There's a demonic manifestation that's kind of impelling him. So what appears to have happened is that Leland got involved with Ben Horn and other people who owns this sort of prostitution, One-Eye Jacks, this house of ill repute across the border. So he's not really subject to all the laws, One-Eye Jacks. And then maybe at some point, Leland had also gotten deeper into esoteric stuff, which is why Leland seems to be involved in the sex cult, beyond just the prostitution ring at Ben Horn's One-Eye Jacks. And so, yeah, that's the deep dark secret here, is that there is a kind of a pedo, incest sex cult going on. And if we pay attention to, say, season 2 of Twin Peaks with Wyndham Earl, you have people in the intelligence establishment that are trying to tap into the dark side. They want to actually harness satanic energy. And I think that's the explanation for the Garmin Bosia. You have these sort of demonic-ish entities or these beings from another dimension that kind of inhabit this, Black Lodge or the place in between. And they want to feed on Garmin Bosia, or the pain and the suffering of people in this life that are abused by the people that they possess. So they can possess a serial killer, the one-armed man, Bob, etc., and try to get those people to commit evil actions, which feeds those demons. So I think that's all very profound. I mean, I actually believe a lot of that, being orthodox, but I think David Lynch's vantage point is much more like a Tibetan Buddhist kind of spirituality here. But Tibetan Buddhism believes in, the demonic. So you have the idea of tulpas, especially in season 3 when we get fake Agent Cooper, who's a tulpa. Uh, you get elements of theosophy kind of playing a role here. So I think it does pull from different religious traditions and even shamanism, as well as ritual magic. But you also have other conspiracy things tying in too, like aliens. You've got the major, I forget his name, but he's the guy that plays the general in Stargate, but Major Briggs. Major Briggs is there to investigate on the behalf of the military and the deep state, you could say, what they think are alien manifestations, but it's actually the same thing as all the spiritual demonic manifestations. So it's not actually aliens, but there's a white lodge and a black lodge. And I think this one picture that somebody drew, I don't know who drew it, but it kind of encapsulates like the spirituality of the whole Twin Peaks world. If you can see it, it's like you've got
Yeah, I saw you show this in your stream. It's very interesting. It's the two peaks with sort of
yes,
I guess you could call it a zigzag of three rectangles touching on
yeah.
each end.
You've got the white lodge up top, you've got the black lodge at the bottom, and they're kind of in these diamond structures in between the two mountains, the two peaks. And the diamond in the middle is the portal, which is the pool out in the woods. It's like it looks like like a naturally occurring sort of pool of oil.
Mm.
And they describe it as kind of having this demonic kind of burning oil smell when they go out there. But yeah, it's a portal, it's a pathway into the next dimension, and yeah, so that's what's going on in Twin Peaks.
Wow. Yeah, it's fascinating. And you mentioned the term mystical toponymy. I think it's very relevant that they're crossing the border to go to One-Eyed Jack's. This sort of implied this liminal space, this boundary zone,
Yes.
which is often very mystical in many different folklores. There's all sorts of lore about whether it's gateways or however it's termed. But I'm curious, there's also the mention of Twilight language, which we know Twilight language quite well. We've interviewed Michael Hoffman here on the show, and mystical toponymy is one term that I think him and Mr. Oh, geez, I'm drawing a blank on the dang fool's name. I know him well, but Hoffman and Shelby Downer, James Shelby Downer,
Yeah.
kind of popularized mystical toponymy with their King Kill
Yeah.
33. So it seems like David Lynch was at least privy to the conspiracy culture of America. But do you think that like as far as Twilight language goes, like what major themes did you notice?
I think he is familiar with that because that's actually part of Tibetan Buddhism. And even in the sort of the normie kind of Western Dalai Lama familiar aspects of Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism and whatnot, it's called Sandabhyasa. And I'd actually forgotten about this, and I was looking it up a couple of days ago. So this is actually pretty providential. Synchronicity, man. Sandabhyasa is their term for Twilight language. It's actually an old concept that comes out of Eastern religions, and the idea, at least on the surface, is just simply that it's talking in code. So basically, if you want to talk about something that not everybody who's initiated can understand, you speak in code. One example of this is when those traditions, for example, talk about the lotus. People say, "Oh, you're talking about some sort of a flower symbol." No, it's actually the vagina. So in just basic Sandabhyasa, talking about a lotus literally refers to vagina. And there's quite a bit of tantric sex magic stuff that uses that idea. But it also might relate to the layout of space, right? So spatial toponymy is what we're talking about here, with the idea that there are places that are sacred. There's places that are perhaps consecrated to dark forces. Names take on a key significance here, where you have a term that might refer to one thing, but also refers to something else. And so that's where the toponymy or the layout of the land turns into something mystical. And I think just a really basic example would be like we had in that diagram where you have, the middle place between these two peaks is precisely the portal that takes you either to the hell dimension or the demon dimension or the in between. So so even the term that, Twin Peaks, we could think of this as like two pillars, like in masonry of Jachin and Boaz. That represents good and evil, male, female, very similar to like yin yang type stuff. Carl Jung talks about this in his Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious book, which is I'm reading right now. I just read that chapter actually on anima and animus and anima, and he's talking about that very point. But what I'm saying is that even though what we might think of as, say, symbolic correspondences can also relate to places and names, and that's really where mystical toponymy comes into play. Lost highway, I mean, I think that's another type of term where you have this idea of, like you said, the liminal space. You're driving, out in the desert like Fred Madison does in Lost Highway, and it's almost like he drives off into another dimension. And so what's a lost highway? Well, I think Hoffman used examples of something like Route 66 and, driving out to Death Valley, this kind of terminology would suggest, negative spiritual forces, this kind of stuff. So that's kind of the idea behind mystical toponymy.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's the road of the dead spirits or something like that in Spanish.
Yeah.
This road that has historically been there for
Right.
however long the natives have been there, and yeah, now this is exactly where the Trinity bombing site is, which is another
Yes.
theme in Lynch's work. There's this, not just in Twin Peaks, but in several of his films. There's the
Actually,
reference, right?
this is a huge part of season 3. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you,
No,
but
it's
you just
okay.
reminded me. The Trinity explosion is a huge part of season 3. And actually a demon comes through the portal when the bomb goes off in season 3.
Now, season 3 came out in 2017. Lynch, did he have his hands on that at all? I'm completely in the dark as far as that one.
Oh yeah. In fact,
Okay.
I mean, I was really hyped for it, looking forward to it. There was a lot of concern because there was fear it wouldn't get made, and then Showtime was who sort of came to the rescue to make sure that it did get made. And I think they pretty much gave David Lynch, final cut, and he made all those decisions.
Yeah.
And actually, I did mention Hoffman in my chapter on season 3. So you're correct that mystical toponymy plays a key role, I think, in season 3. Again, precisely because of the Trinity site explosions being
it's
a portal that opens.
Yeah, it's such a big part of American culture. I think just the road trip, it's a classic American idea. We all have this pioneering spirit, whether you're in the Midwest or the West and your ancestors actually, traveled on a Conestoga wagon, or, if you're like me and you're some kind of East Coast mutt and your family came over on ships. We all have this adventurous sort of spirit in us as Americans. It's sort of the frontier still in many ways,
Right.
and Lynch definitely plays on that. But with Lost Highway, there is a lead in to his film Inland Empire as well, right?
I think there's a loose connection between. I mean, you could argue there's a loose connection between all of David Lynch's canon in some way, at least in his mind. And you'll notice a lot of times these characters kind of pop in and out from one story to the next, right? In Lost Highway, you have Sailor and Lula driving down what looks like the Lost Highway, and they encounter who appears to be Audrey Horne, right? So it's the same character from Twin Peaks, and she seems to have had a wreck and a head wound. And then when we come over to that's in Wild at Heart. Then when we come over to Lost Highway, Fred seems to be on that same Lost Highway. He gets a head wound when he's in prison, and then we get this sort of dissociation into the life of Pete in the second half of the film. So yeah, there's always these kind of overlaps. You get Laura Palmer appears to show up in Wild at Heart as the good witch of the West, at the end of the film, who encourages Nick Cage to go and and kiss Laura Dern to make sure that they don't part ways. So, David Lynch talks about these different worlds and different portals and dimensions and dream worlds, and he kind of sees them as infinite and perhaps overlapping. And that's partly due, I think, to his influence from Hinduism, transcendental meditation, all that kind of stuff that he's into or was into. That plays a role, I think, in his metaphysics. And I didn't even realize until pretty recently, I was reading about Inland Empire. It's relying pretty heavily on a lot of Hindu concepts. So you have reincarnation there. You have this. I didn't even realize this, but apparently Lynch got some of these ideas from not Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, but some other yogi dude who talks about contrasting the palace and the marketplace and the different worlds and portals of how we live our lives in these different domains. And I didn't know any of that was part of Inland Empire, but now that I do, it's like clearly that's part of the motif of how you're supposed to interpret this. So
Yeah, it seems like the caste system, the sort of what do they call it in India? The undesirables are sort of the way. I don't know if this is directly portrayed in Inland Empire, but the end of the film where she's sort of like, just rambling around.
He's with like the people who are drug addicts and stuff.
Right. Which
the prostitutes. Yeah.
I don't remember when that film was made by him, but I imagine at the time that was something that was less common than it is now. That was something that was maybe more local to West Coast cities like LA. Skid Row's been around for a really long time. And then, San Francisco has their Tenderloin area. But it seems like now we look at that and we're like, oh yeah, I mean, that could be any American city with drug addicts all over the place wandering around,
Yeah, it was prior
nonsense.
to like fentanyl. You're right about that. Like that was prior to that whole I would say, intentional culture war where they allowed that to be flooded into America. But yeah, I think that, there's a lot of things going on with the Laura Dern character. It's breaking the fourth wall. She's intended to be herself to a degree. And it overlaps between, whether she's really having these experiences or whether it's happening in her head. And she's seeing back to her past life when she was a human trafficked prostitute, Polish girl in a previous generation. So it kind of flips back and forth between those worlds and those lifetimes. But I think you're right to point out the marketplace and the palace, because when she becomes essentially kind of a street prostitute drug addict, I mean, she's become a marketable item. And I think Lynch is saying, yeah, Hollywood markets these actresses as items and as products. That's exactly what's in Mulholland Drive, because then Naomi Watts' character wins this contest. She goes to Hollywood. She thinks she's going to be the next A-list star. That's why you see, posters on her wall that are all these old school starlets from the golden days of Hollywood. And the whole point of the film is that she ends up as a crack whore. But a lot of the film, we're seeing her sort of dissociative idea about like what she thinks is happening and how she's a star and how she got screwed over. And a lot of that's fake. Like everything I think after the car wreck is like, in her head or whatever, if I remember. But yeah, so Lynch is, I think, playing with all these different ideas from disassociation to, like you said, knowledge of American conspiracy culture, to, nods to Hitchcock, nods to Sunset Boulevard, old classic Hollywood films. Even the prawn side of Hollywood with the Roseanne Arquette character under Mr. Eddie, right? Obviously, he's an organized crime figure who, he's making prawn, and she's one of his actresses. So it's all over the place, and then that's all tied into weird Tibetan and Hindu metaphysics. I mean, it's just wild. I mean, I don't even know what to. I don't think there's anything like. I mean, that's why people called it Lynchian. I mean, I don't even know what do you liken it to. It's not really like anything else.
Yeah. Well, you comment on the background weirdos that are present in a lot of his work, and it reminds me of an art class learning about Hieronymus Bosch and his absurd sort of paintings. You look and it's just flooded with like
Great analogy.
every,
Yeah.
character you can imagine, and especially in the what was it, Blue Velvet, or another film, I forget which one, where there's a villain character and he's sort of tormenting this other character, and there's this gang of people behind him.
Yeah, it's Blue Velvet. It's
Right.
that famous. You've got Dean Stockwell, who, by the way, was at least Dave McGowan and other people speculate that he was in the OTO.
Wow.
And he's the one singing the Roy Orbison, Blue Velvet song. And there's just all this crowd of just absolute complete weirdos that are part of Dennis Hopper's gang. And I mean, he's just like this completely insane villain who huffs, it was supposed to be laughing gas or whatever, but I mean, he's just nuts. And it's a great villain character. But before I did the podcast the other night talking about Lynch's stuff, I watched a whole bunch of Lynch interviews. I mean, a bunch that were just with him, Charlie Rose, him and Naomi Watts, and a lot of it's comedy. And David Lynch was very open about how a lot of his films were intentionally just comedic, and other actors and people were talking about how he had such a great sense of humor and the absurd. And I think that's another reason I like it, is absurdist humor is kind of my bag. So he's putting a lot of stuff in there that's just because it's funny. And the more I watch like Bald at Heart, I mean, that film always gets funnier the more I watch it. So
Interesting. Yeah, I definitely need to revisit Lynch's work, especially, post mortem. I think his impact is going to probably be a bit of a ripple effect. People are going to jump to say, oh, this was inspired by Lynch, and maybe there'll even be some Lynch exploitation or something like that.
yeah, right.
But
That's a good way to put it.
yeah.
Have you seen Wild at Heart?
No, that's one I haven't seen. And
Oh yeah, it's great. That's one of my favorites. You
yeah,
gotta watch that one.
definitely.
And by the way, the cowboy makes an appearance in Wild at Heart, and he also makes, of course, a memorable appearance in Mulholland Drive.
Yeah, well, and you mentioned that earlier, that there are several overlaps. It's almost like the realm, the canon of Lynch's films, similar to the way people talk about Tarantino, where he kind of builds this world that all of his films exist in. And
Exactly.
yeah, it's fascinating. But on the point of symbolism in Twilight Zone, or well, Twilight language particularly, not Twilight Zone, but I'm sure that had an impact on Lynch.
Yeah.
The rotating objects, and you pointed this out in your stream that you did recently, and as soon as you said that, I pictured a scene in my mind from Twin Peaks with like I think it was as simple as just a fan on a desk.
Ceiling
But
fan. Yeah.
well, it was there. There was a ceiling fan, but I remember like one of those old school, like wire frame kind of just desk fans that,
Right.
one shot where he just spends some time focusing on that. So there's several, moments like that where he's showing this, and then the road we just mentioned is another symbol, sort of object symbol that he uses. But what did you connect the rotating objects to?
Well, I mean, it's a circle, it's cyclical. I mean, I think that's intended to be the idea of the wheel. You have this in Hinduism and a lot of Eastern religions, that there's this cycle of time, and you're sort of in this trap until you can transcend it, achieve nirvana, release yourself from the wheel of time. So that's an element of it. The movies themselves are oftentimes cyclical. Lost Highway ends the very point it begins, with Fred driving down the Lost Highway. The opening sequence is, if I recall, is the same as the end. And I think he's just trying to say that, his take on philosophy, history, metaphysics is this kind of cyclical perspective. It's not linear. Hence, it's more like a dream. Stories have beginning, middle, and end, and a lot of his movies kind of jump around. So they're not linear; they're more cyclical. The ancient pagan view of history was that it was a never-ending eternal return cycle, and not a beginning, middle, and end. So that's, I think, what is going on with a lot of that symbolism. And you'll find it too, even in the music videos, like All the Things, him and Krista Bell, that has the record spinning. Multiple David Lynch music videos have the record spinning. So I think that's the purpose.
Right. And we know that people who are epileptic, or is it epileptic? I can't say that word more than once. Um, when they're exposed to, flashing lights, it can induce, certain seizures and things like that. There's also a gentleman who built some sort of device that he was kind of prolific. I'm having a massive blame it on Huel, folks. Not a show sponsor. My brain, I feel like I'm firing on some cylinders tonight. But there's this guy who he built like this device, and he was pretty inspirational. I think I've even heard you talk about him in past talks. He was like not H.G. Wells, but in that milieu of British people, scientist
You mean
types.
like Wilhelm Reich and Orgone?
Well, there's Wilhelm Reich, but no, this guy was more British, and he was specifically from London. But he created some kind of device that he called like a dream scope or something. But it worked with lights to induce a sort of effect. I guess just a little tangent to point out that flickering lights is another symbol that's reoccurring in
Yeah,
Lynch's work. What do you think
gotcha.
of
Yeah,
that?
I think I know what you're talking about. I don't remember the name of that guy that created the first sort of. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I think in David Lynch's films, when it comes to flickering lights, it's intended to be the sign of something supernatural or demonic that's invading the here and the now. Because we see the flickering lights when Chris Isaac in Fire Walk with Me, when he arrives at the diner right away, the lights flicker and they see like the people that are in the above the gas station that were involved in the weird spirits and the woodsmen appear and then they disappear. Um, the cowboy in Mulholland Drive appears when the lights flicker. Um, I'm sure there's many other instances when I think the lights flicker when Laura Palmer is laying in the morgue and Cooper's investigating and he sees Bob,
Mhm.
maybe. Um, or he sees Gerard, I can't remember. But anyway, the point being is that this seems to be a recurring motif whenever David Lynch wants to introduce almost like an atmospheric disturbance due to something from that realm stepping into this realm. So there's like this electrical disturbance. It happens when David Bowie uh, walks into the FBI headquarters and disappears. There's like this electrical disturbance that affects the video recorders.
Hmm.
When he says, I'm not going to talk about Judy," and then he disappears, and then he doesn't come back. We don't know what happens to him until season 3 of Twin Peaks when he appears. I won't spoil that for you, but it's kind of goofy. Agent Jeffries, that's his name. He
Okay.
teleports basically. So
Well, and I remembered who I was thinking of. It was William S. Burroughs, and he created something called the Dream Machine. A
oh
poet and artist, I guess. But yeah, it operated with flickering lights, and I think it caused some research into that phenomena that causes seizures. There's somehow related to that, but
yeah.
either way, fascinating to think that we have all of this in Lynch's work. It's really like a mythology in itself. I know you mentioned Mark Frost sort of did the secret history of
Right.
Twin Peaks, but there definitely ought to be a sort of Twilight language of David Lynch's work, because overall it's fascinating, the depth of it. But you talk about Twin Peaks and maybe Lynch's work in general as a sort of shamanic journey. Has he explicitly talked about that at all? Is there any in those reviews that you did of his interviews? Has
So
he mentioned that?
he made the statement. I think it's from an interview. He said, "I learned that," and he may be talking about transcendental meditation. I don't remember the context, but the quote is, "I learned that just beneath the surface, there's another world." So he could be talking about the unconscious. Probably when when you go into the transcendental meditation state, you're sort of like pulling out of the subconscious these ideas. And he says, and still different worlds if you dig deeper. That's pretty, Jungian, or you can find that in the shamanic tradition. And the reason I said shamanic tradition is because Through the darkness of futures past, a magician longs to see one chance out between two worlds, fire walk with me. Well, walking on coals or fire, that's what, shamans do. That's what, indigenous religious rites are usually connected to that. And I remember reading Iliada at the time, his book on shamanism, and he talked about it as not a religion, but a technique of ecstasy, the system of ecstatic and therapeutic methods whose purpose is to obtain contact with parallel worlds, universe of spirits, and to win over their support in dealing with the affairs of this life. And I thought that was just, perfectly described the idea of fire walk with me, doing a fire walk. But actually, that was in Peter Levenda's Sinister Forces trilogy. It was the first place I saw that. And he wrote, this strange little verse is a key to unlocking the mysteries not only of Twin Peaks, but most of Lynch's films. The suspension of the normal laws of time, hence the term futures past, that's cyclical history, and the idea that the magician lives between two worlds, the suspension of normal linear narratives in favor of a dreamlike hallucinatory set of images. This is all just shamanic to me. Yeah. And it fit perfectly with what I was reading in Iliada at the time. And Iliada and these people, they're like sort of famous comparative religion scholars.
Wow. We just had an interview on this show. It was one of the most interesting talks I've had in a long time with this guy who, very smart, but, by all appearances, he might be a nutcase. I think that's kind of the beauty of it sometimes. But he was talking to us about Qigong and this idea about reality and time being understood best through music rather than spatial relationships, right? And you just kind of reminded me of that. He talks about I think it's the 3/5 arrangement as just that interplay between the future and the past, and that music is kind of like this bridge between the two. But it's fascinating.
Well, in season 3 of Twin Peaks, to add to that point, I don't know much about Chinese philosophy or Qigong, but Lynch does include that idea in season 3, because if you remember at the end of Mulholland Drive, he says no high bando, there is no tape. At first it says it's all recorded, it's just a tape, and then at the end there is no tape, there is no recording. So we get the idea of, well, is the world like a record playing in a circle? A record is also a phonograph. In season 3, we get this giant universe phonograph that plays souls into existence. And so I wrote about how we get this flash into the spirit realm in season 3, and we see Laura's soul being created and sung into existence or played like a giant instrument through this universal phonograph. And this actually refers to, if you've never seen Robert Flood's Temple of Music, this was a ancient Renaissance idea. Here's a little picture of the Temple of Music. And the idea is that the universe is being sung into existence. And you can go back to like Pythagoras, who believed that musical notes and numbers were the secret to reality, and that reality corresponds to different notes that correspond to the celestial spheres, and they're being sung into existence or played into existence. So that's actually what I put in that chapter, because that's apparently some part of what's going on in season 3 of Twin Peaks.
Wow. I'm really glad I made that connection, and judging by how much my audience loved that interview, they'll really love that part. And
this would definitely vibe with that. It's called, if you want the specifics, I'll read this. The theater in the palace itself is a kind of giant phonograph with pipes. And when the male and female aspects come together, Laura is sung or played into existence. This is her soul. And this is in the vein of the Pythagorean and Renaissance Neoplatonic conception of the musica universalis. Look up the Musica Universalis, and you'll notice that in this system, the celestial and planetary spheres that go in big circles like a record play the notes that are sung, or it's the musical vibration that's occurring at different pitches, and that this creates reality and the harmony of the universe. Various esoteric philosophers have theorized upon this, one of which is Robert Flood's Temple of Music. And so that's a big part of season 3 of Twin Peaks.
Well, and on that note, as far as music goes, did you look into David Lynch's thoughts on that, his approach to that? When I think about Twin Peaks, I think about sort of synths. I sort of think about, kind of moody music. But was there anything worth noting about his approach to scoring his work?
I remember him saying stuff in interviews like the sound is just as important as any scene, and he would say stuff like every visual place is a world and a story. And so he would just kind of let these things come to him. And so like if he walked into a park and he liked the visual scenery there, he would say, well, what's the story? And he would try to get this inspiration of an entire world built up from this one event or this one scene. And then he would do the same thing with sound and try to build or allow an entire world to be built out of the scene and the sound that goes with it. And sometimes he says even the sound is more important than the scene. And he would hear a sound and then try to craft the visual imagery of the scene from the sound, which is very uncommon. That's not what a lot of directors would do. So in that regard, yeah, I would say like David Lynch saw himself as just as much a musician as a film director. Again, because if you have this sort of musica universalis conception, everything is kind of a music. Everything is kind of a vibration, so to speak, being sung into existence or spoken into existence. I mean, the Orthodox or the Bible conception, when God speaks, it's his logos that brings reality into existence. So I think even in Christianity, this is there. By the way, if you've ever read C.S. Lewis's Narnia, in the very first one, before Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe, it's a magician's nephew. Aslan does this very thing. He sings Narnia and the world into existence. So this is also part of. By the way, also it's in Lord of the Rings. I think the Valar sing Middle Earth into existence too. Anyway, this comes out of Neoplatonism. I think that's definitely going on in David Lynch's music as well, and so he probably sees that as kind of creating reality in a smaller sense from what the music and the sound is doing. I'm thinking of like if you watch the song he did with Krista Bell, Bird of Flames, that is about the phoenix, which is a bird of flames, right? Which arises out of the ashes. And the video is very bizarre. It's very Lynchian, obviously. And she sort of emerges from a cocoon. But even when she emerges from the cocoon, it's like she's controlled by sort of puppeteer strings. So, I mean, I'm not sure what we're supposed to think that pop stars are controlled puppets. I don't know, but there's a lot of sort of monarch symbology going on in that video.
Yeah, and I hadn't heard of this artist before you had shown her work in your breakdown in the stream. Was she very successful as a pop star? It didn't seem like.
Krista Bell's not huge. No, she's more kind of into indie and lesser known, but she was very close to Lynch towards the production time of season 3. And he put her in as one of the FBI agents in charge of the Blue Rose case. And so if you watch Fire Walk with Me, then you remember when Kiefer Sutherland and Chris Isaac are talking to David Lynch. He's explaining that it's a Blue Rose, right? It's a Blue Rose case, which we later find out is basically like X-Files. It's a case where there's supernatural phenomenon that the FBI is investigating. So there might be a little bit of a nod to X-Files there. And David Lynch did cast, or they put David Duchovny in Twin Peaks as this kind of goofball cross-dressing character. So there might be some nods to X-Files there as well. But point being is that Blue Rose we later find out is a supernatural case. But in season 3, Krista Bell plays the FBI agent tasked with the Blue Rose case. And then all of those songs that Lynch wrote for a good while. I mean, he did some songs with some other pop stars like Lee. But he did a whole album with Krista Bell. So they seem to have a pretty close, she was probably his muse for that period.
Mm,
So that's why I kept referencing her. But
interesting. Yeah, one artist that comes to mind, or group that comes to mind, is the Cocteau Twins. I don't know if Lynch used their work. Maybe he did.
oh, he did in
Yeah.
Lost Highway. And in
Okay.
fact, it's a very important sequence at the end of Lost Highway. Yeah.
Yeah, and we've talked to Chris Knowles here on the show plenty of times, and he does a great breakdown of all the strange things with Elizabeth Fraser and the Cocteau twins, and how she's connected to the death of Chris Cornell in some ways, not as a guilty party, but maybe in more of this sort of deadly muse, a siren
Oh, I don't know anything about that. That's interesting.
yeah, well, I encourage you
Huh.
to look into it because
Okay.
Chris does a great job, similar work to you with breakdown of media, and yeah, I think you both, if you did
Is he the
collaborate,
guy that wrote the Heroes Wear Spandex book?
he wrote that. Yeah, he
Yeah.
was a
Okay.
comic book illustrator, so he's
Gotcha.
also versed in that world. But yeah, he also wrote a book about rock and roll and the different metaphysical aspects of certain bands. And on that note, you mentioned an actor that Lynch worked with who was in the OTO, but David Bowie was a part of Fire Walks with Me, and he was, big
Golden Dawn.
Crowley, and yeah,
Yeah.
a Crowley
Great point.
fan, and a part of the Golden Dawn. And I just found that kind of interesting that he has like the Crowley full spread, OTO and Golden Dawn. And Lynch is kind of Crowleyan in many ways because
I think there
Crowley,
is. Yeah, there's a Crowley element there for sure. Absolutely. And then Mark Frost intentionally does explain that it's explicitly supposed to be Crowleyan in terms of the mythos of Twin Peaks.
hmm,
That's in the book. There's a giant picture of Crowley in multiple pages about the Crowleyan side of the mythos of Twin Peaks. Um, yeah, I think you're absolutely right there. And then there was another. Dave McGowan mentions, and I mean, I'm not saying Dave McGowan's 100% right on every single thing. I mean, he was just sort of theorizing, but he mentions also the possibility that Dennis Hopper might have also perhaps been either involved in or interested in the OTO. And then Dean Stockwell is the guy that's singing. Um, he's pantomiming the Roy Orbison Blue Velvet song in Blue Velvet. And there's this weird sort of fixation that Dennis Hopper, who's playing the crazy Frank character, sort of has this weird obsession with Dean Stockwell singing the song. It's supposed to be absurd and funny. It's not like super gay. I mean, it's kind of gay, but it's not. It's supposed to be funny and absurdist because Crazy Frank is so crazy. Um, but Dean Stockwell is also a recurring David Lynch character. He plays a key role in Dune. And then you have even in Dune, Lynch, I don't know if it's his idea or him and other people, but they included the sort of Kabbalistic idea within Dune that the weirding way allows you to speak reality into existence to destroy, to give a healing word or a killing word. Are you a Dune fan? Have you watched?
yeah, I've seen the film a while ago, so I know about it. I know some of the references.
Yeah, that's not in. I mean, there's the weirding way is in the novel Dune by Frank Herbert, but this idea that like you can attune it to like to speak a weapon
Hmm.
like it's hard to like you have to watch the movie Dune and they like speak
Well,
a word and it like
we
kills
we've
people.
we've actually
Um,
talked about this concept in a different context as it relates to Mongolian shamanism, and it's a practice in several different indigenous forms of shamanism where a practitioner creates a spiritual dart and then sends it
okay,
to their adversary through the astral realm, and it could kill them, it could strike them ill.
that has to be where Lynch is getting that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, and they even create like sort of like token spiritual darts, and they'll carry them with them.
Huh.
So they'll have like the visualization tool of, okay, this is what it looks like. And each shaman has their own. So yeah, it's a very sophisticated kind of spiritual warfare, if you will, and in a kind of a rudimentary astral way where
Right.
Castaneda writes about this a little bit. I mean, you could take Castaneda's work with a big grain of salt because he became a full-fledged cult leader by the end of his life.
Right.
but yeah, he writes about, this sort of astral warfare that the different
Yes, sure.
sorcerers
I
would
read I
do.
read one of his books. I forget the title of it, but that makes perfect sense. Yeah, and it could Lynch could be pulling from, if he was interested in Red Crowley, then he could have pulled from like Kabbalistic elements that Crowley used,
Mm.
but also he could have gotten it out of the. Did you say Tibetan Buddhist or Tibet?
Yeah,
Where did you?
The Mongolian shamanism, which is
Yes,
very
that's
close to Tibetan Buddhism. So
that's
yeah.
where Lynch could have pulled it to. Either one. I mean, the Kabbalistic idea that you as an individual magus can, speak beings and life solidity into existence, like the logos. The Kabbalist idea is that you can do the same thing with, speaking and thus magic words, etc. So,
Mm,
yeah,
mm.
I'm sure he's pulling from that as well. Sound is really key to this whole philosophy of, vibrations either being geared towards the intentionality of life or towards death.
Yeah. Well, and we mentioned the significance of place names, but was there any particular significance to the choice in character names? Because there are some, I mean, they're not exactly run of the mill names. They do fit the setting in some ways, but yeah, I wonder if there was any thought put into the naming of the
Usually in
characters.
literature, there is. And obviously, movies are also partly literature because they have to be written out, and they're usually short stories or they're, screenplays written out. So, yeah, I would say probably names are generally relevant. I'm trying to think through some of the names.
Well, is it Judy that is married to Leland and they're the parents of Laura Palmer? Is that
Yes.
right? So,
And then the demon, you haven't seen season 3 yet, but when you see season 3, Judy is a very important name because she's identified as Jiao Day, the Mesopotamian demon
right.
entity. So, yeah,
Well,
great
and
example there with Jiao Day or Jude.
when I heard you mention that, and it made me think of Crowley's relationships with women that often ended in very chaotic ways. And, Crowley writes about taking his uh, homosexual lover into the desert and basically
Yeah,
starving him to the point of, I don't know, I mean, it was borderline abuse when you read about
right.
it. But yeah, he was attempting to, like, engage with this. Egyptian deity. I forget
Yeah.
exactly which one it was for that particular ritual, but there is a Crowleyan aspect to the possession of the mother as well.
Yeah. She ends up possessed in a key figure, and that's because it doesn't really make sense, but there's something about the death of the birth of Laura Palmer is supposed to signify the end of the world, and that the demonic entity wants to possess Laura and destroy her. It's really kind of out there, and I don't remember exactly what all the details are at the end of season 3, but I know that much is true. I'm trying to think of other names that might have significance. I mean, in
Well, I do find the name Palmer interesting because my middle name is Palmer, and I looked into this, and the term Palmer originally referred to somebody who would take holy palm leaves from the Holy Land and bring them back to Europe on a pilgrimage, or during
okay,
the conquest, or the Crusades rather. They
yeah,
would they
yeah,
would be palmers basically. They would
okay.
bring palm leaves back to Europe for the different what is it, Palm Sunday, right? So yeah, there could be something there where she's I don't know what Laura, maybe Laurel. I mean, there's this
Yeah,
sort of Virgo quality to that. You think of like the Virgin, a bundle of grain, things like that.
absolutely. Yeah. I'm just trying to think through characters. Fred Madison. I mean, he goes mad.
Yeah.
That was kind of obvious. Um,
Well, wasn't there a character in what was it? One of his newer or more recent works that had like a Polish, is it Inland Empire, where there's like a Polish
yeah,
guy
that's Inland
named
Empire. Yeah.
Balzabar or something like that?
Oh yeah, there may have been. I don't remember the names. That
Yeah,
that sounds
There
plausible.
there was you referenced it in your stream, and yeah, it was like Balzabar, and I thought to myself, like, "Geez, is that a common Polish name?" Because
Right,
it
right,
sounds a
right, right.
lot like Basilbub, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. I know. Bob and Alm and Lamb. I wrote a section on that. I think those names had significance for sure. Where
Mm.
was that?
Well, and, what is it, Cooper, Agent Cooper? I mean, anytime I hear the name Cooper, I think of DB Cooper, the great, bandit, but there's also the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, which is incredibly significant to American culture. I mean, Cooper is definitely in the toponomical realm of things.
Yes. So the Mark Frost book makes reference to Jack Parsons and Parsons' um, attempt at doing rituals to open up a portal, and that relates, I think, to Crowley's idea of Lamb as this gray looking alien entity. And I wrote, as we will see, this alien imagery becomes important when we understand the Crowleyan concept of Lamb, the interdimensional entity that Crowley contacted. Um, the owls are a big part of Twin Peaks, right? And the owls also relates to the esoteric and the occult, which I covered in this chapter. But that's a side issue, because what I said was many were mystified when in season 3, Agent Cooper goes into a purple mauve dimension. He seemed to be able to float, and when he was unable to exit the lodge at the appointed time, this is due to Bob being unwilling to return. In the latest episode of when I wrote this, the time was season 3, episode 8, we witnessed the same thing. A Baphomet-looking entity emerged from the atomic void, and the vomiting forth a profane word of ectoplasm. That's the demon that comes to the Trinity Sands explosion. And then we see a giving birth to a new child, Bob, amidst a bunch of moonchild eggs. This confusing imagery could likely come from the works of Kenneth Grant. One of the most relevant of his works is Beyond the Mauve Zone, which describes the astral plane. Grant describes that Lamb is the equivalent of the Eastern chant of Om. And this is, again, 3 letters, very similar to B-O-B. So Lamb, Om, Bob. That's all according to Kenneth Grant, who's the head. So the OTO had a split. There's like the U.S. branch, and then there's the British Typhonian OTO, and Kenneth Grant was kind of the guy that wrote all the books for the UK's Typhonian OTO. And he says that Set is the seat or the throne of Isis, and he's sometimes represented as the goddess Typhon, who hold before her the Ankh of existence. Set is the projection of the child of Typhon, the crowned and conquering child typified by Lamb. Liber Al prophesies the advent on earth of Lamb, and Lamb is pictured as a crown headdress, a dwarf deity. He is the god of the new Aeon, the god in Amenta, or the hidden god, the headless god of the Gnostics, also equivalent to Samael. We've heard the name of Lamb, which applies to man's total awareness, divided into 3 stages: L-A-M, L for dream state, A for awake state, M for deep sleep. Anyone who has successfully used the formula will know that the egg of Lamb serves as a space capsule which conveys the traveler to the desired plane or dimension. And he's talking about in the astral realm. So there is your dwarf god, the midget man from another place, which Kenneth Grant proceeds to connect these ideas as an entrance into the mauve zone, which is exactly where Cooper ends up in season 3.
Yeah, and this is the
Oh, you said Laurel. She's the crowned prom queen of Twin Peaks.
wow.
Laura Palmer, the crowned one.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I didn't even remember I wrote that in there. So
There
yeah.
you go. Well, and it seems like the climax too of a shamanic journey to go into the other realm, to reach that visionary
Exactly. No, that's
state.
exactly what a
Yeah.
shaman is trying to do.
Yeah.
100%.
It's fascinating to see the many layers of that through Lynch's work. You talk about is it Blue Velvet or Wild at Heart, Mulholland Drive, and Inland Empire are the
The
Hollywood trilogy.
Hollywood-ish trilogy. Yeah, it's a
Yeah,
loose kind of Hollywood trilogy.
yeah, and it's interesting because the MK Ultra theme is very shamanic because it's all about trauma. And I mean, you go into shamanism and they're scarring the face, putting hooks in their breasts and all sorts of incredibly traumatic,
Yeah.
painful things to, reach these states. And, when you see it in the film, you realize like, wow, there's this, real deep spiritual energy here. But to the average person, maybe it just seems like you said, it's very funny, or, if someone has a particularly dark sense of humor or isn't very sensitive to violence or graphic sex, they might just think, oh, that's kind of crazy. But, I have this sense that Lynch is trying to like take the audience into a certain state of mind with every step of his film. Is it fair to say that, people who watch Lynch's work are initiated unknowingly?
That could be an element. I think you see that with Kubrick. I argued that with the Eyes Wide Shut chapter in Kubrick, that it's initiation, maybe with 2001 as well. And yeah, if David Lynch sees the director or the artist, director, musician as a shaman, putting out his creation, his will and intention into the world, then that's exactly what magic or the shamanic idea is intended to do, right? To be the bridge between these two worlds. And that's why Lynch is always characterizing himself as the person who goes into the inner subconscious realm in transcendental meditation and pulls the ideas from that space, which is a kind of liminal space, which is also perhaps the astral realm, perhaps the unconscious, the realm of potentia, whatever, and then creates a world and puts that created world into this world. That's the job of the shaman, is to be that bridge and to affect the magic. I mean, I'm saying that's that's the magician type perspective. So
Mm,
yeah, I think that's what's going on for sure,
yeah.
with Lynch, and that's how he sees himself. And yeah, he probably would say, I don't know, I'm just speculating. He probably would say that it is kind of a initiation for the audience too.
Mm. And I don't know this, maybe you know this, but was he working on anything prior to his death? And do you think we'll see anything post-mortem released of his body of
A
work?
good question. You know what? I got so busy with kind of other stuff that I was doing that I kind of didn't expect David Lynch to pass away. I wasn't, it kind of threw me
Wasn't
for
in
a
the
loop. I wasn't
cards.
expecting that. So I don't know kind of what he was up to. I was listening to I followed the music stuff. I liked the stuff he was doing with Christabel. I bought all that stuff, but I hadn't even kept up like with what he was doing in the last few years. So I don't even know. It's a good
Right.
question.
Well, obviously, David Lynch is just one aspect of your work. How the your esoteric Hollywood trilogy, not his Hollywood trilogy.
Well, he
Uh,
made it into all three, so he's probably the
right.
only director that's going to be, because I'm going to have Lost Highway
Well, I
and
was
probably
gonna
some.
ask you, like, next
Right.
to him and maybe Stanley Kubrick, like, is there any other director you can think of that you've written about to this length, or has made as much of an impact, even if you didn't write about him as much?
Well, Kubrick was like 80 pages in the first one, so yeah, you're right about that. And then Lynch was in part one and part two, and then he'll be in part three. So yeah, he's definitely up there with Kubrick for most written about for sure.
Mm, mm. Is
So
it?
yeah, I can't think of
Yeah.
anyone else that would even be close. I don't even think. I mean, Hitchcock is. I mean, he's not even a big part of.
No.
He's like two chapters in this first one, I think.
Well, and I think Hitchcock's impact was in a different lane, but it is interesting that, Lynch, Kubrick, they sort of are two geniuses in this very small space of time. As we started our conversation, we're saying this is kind of, we're seeing an end of big budget Hollywood and a
Yep.
move towards low budget streaming, whatever we're going to call that. And again, like, what's next? Who could follow something like that up? It's very, it's obviously, I don't think you have a answer, but I'd love to know your thoughts.
Well, it's one of the things David Lynch said towards the end of his life was that he doesn't think that Hollywood will ever have a place for what he was again. So there won't be a place for that kind of a director, trying to do his own stuff and having final cut and all that. And that's probably true, and probably because, as Jamie Kennedy says, Hollywood's pretty much going away the way that it was. It's just part of the legacy system, just like legacy media, legacy education, all those things are kind of dying away.
Mm.
So, what will emerge, what new forms can come about, that remains to be seen. Hopefully we can have, just if we have a lot more decentralization of the internet, just like we think about Bitcoin and money as decentralized now, if we think about maybe the arts getting more and more decentralized, maybe we can have, successful independent stuff. Maybe wealthy people start putting money into this kind of stuff. I don't know.
Mm.
And then you can have the auteur director making a comeback, but it'll have to be something independent and somehow with money behind independent stuff,
Yeah.
which is possible.
Well, and I mean, with the internet, there's an open talent pool for people
That's
who
what
are,
yeah, that's
like,
kind of what I'm getting at there. I don't know how it'll work, but maybe something like that.
yeah. Well, I don't imagine that there will be a follow-up esoteric YouTube or anything like that, but who knows? Maybe Mr. Beast and his peers will give you enough to write about, but
That's
I
funny.
don't
Yeah.
really think that's your interest, though. I doubt that you're watching Mr. Beast very often.
I've not really watched Mr. Beast. I mean, I know of him, but I don't really. I know it's like game show type
Yeah.
challenge stuff.
It's kid-minded stuff. It's
Yeah,
yeah, no
yeah,
adults that are sane are watching Mr. Beast, but it does seem like that's where the only money in Hollywood is in kids
that's
movies,
a
and
good point. Yeah,
for that matter, I mean, they try. There's always that sort of subtle kind of, oh well, we want to make this for the kids, but we got to entertain the adults as well. And I feel like there's a certain sector of that you can just brush off as, oh, they're just trying to make adults laugh. But do you think that kids films have because of all the money that's going into that, those films now, like the brunt of the symbolism is now being shoved into those films rather than maybe how it was in the past?
yeah, maybe. I honestly don't see many kids things, so I don't even know.
Mm.
I mean, I've seen like some cartoons and stuff that's just like Crowley symbolism and satanic stuff in the cartoons, like from Disney and whatnot in the last 10 years. But I don't really see a lot of those kid films, so I don't know. I imagine everything's just based around profit motives, and hence they rely, like you said, on a lot of children's entertainment and rebooting stuff and sequels and prequels. Nobody really seems interested in anything like uh, you know, new stuff. It's a really weird time. I don't even know. I don't know.
Well, in this atmosphere, I think, things like obviously podcasting, which I'm not saying that to pat ourselves on the back, but you look at the way podcasting has kind of taken over what was once mainstream media. I mean, look at someone like Shane Gillis, Joe Rogan, Killed Tony, and all of the
Right.
other comedians. I mean, you've worked with Sam Hyde, and I think everything that he's done since leaving Adult Swim to like keep that brand going and remain authentic and create very interesting, hilarious content, it's incredible. So to talk about the talent pool that exists, I mean, seems like if we're gonna look at someone like Shane Gillis, albeit, he's pretty controversial, connected to conspiracy podcasts, war mode, like these things are starting to become a little bit more mainstream, would you
Right.
say, right? Like it seems like we're heading towards maybe the left becoming, abysmal, whereas the center, maybe even the right, will start to become funded more. Because a lot of this
Yeah.
comedy, it's being picked up by the right, but it's not. It's centered. It's just a reaction to how crazy the left has been.
Yeah, I think you're right about comedy having some success, definitely moving in that direction. But you don't see comedy movies anymore. You know what I mean? Like in the 90s and the 2000s, I mean, there was just comedy movies all the time. And then that kind of like the more we saw the woke stuff, the more comedy movies are pretty much just gone. Very rarely do I see comedy movies that I think are funny that I enjoy. I did like Y2K. I like Kyle Mooney's stuff. I think his stuff's pretty good, but that's few and far between. So yeah, I think the comedians are kind of just forced into the podcast domain, and obviously still doing stand up, but for the unique art form that is film, which is a combination of so many other art forms, and that's what's so amazing about movies is that it's music, it's writing, it's acting, it's set design, it's visual cinematography, photography, playing with time through editing. I mean, it's all these things into one art form, which I think makes it so powerful. Like that is something that needs to be recovered somehow. And that the problem is that takes money and it takes a lot of people. And the right wing and even the center or whatever, they didn't focus on the arts. They just sort of let the left have all of the arts for the last 50, 100 years. And that was a huge mistake, because then the left can use the radical left especially can try to force everybody into their idea of what the arts are, which is activism and insanity. And then you get totally woke arts, which shuts down creativity and it destroys it. So I don't know. Again, there'll have to be some new forms that emerge. I don't know how if there'll be independent production studios funded. Maybe Mel Gibson gives, I don't know, $100 million to some production company that's not bound by woke. I'm just throwing ideas, and then they start making, I mean, there's already Icon Films, which is his thing, but I'm saying like, where's the full production films that are not these corny like pure flicks, or I've never seen a Daily Wire movie. Maybe they're good, I don't know, but like I don't know, it's just something more than that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
I don't know.
absolutely. No, and you make a great point. I mean, growing up, I was born in '94, so I think I'm a little bit younger than you. But growing up, I'm sure this was similar for you. Like the whole like language that people would speak to relate to each other was through movies, like dumb comedy movies. Whenever one would come out, everybody would be talking about it. That was how a lot of people related to one another, is through what movies they liked, and the fact that that has disappeared. I think video games have definitely played a role in that,
Yes,
especially,
right.
because we have this generation gap where now there's a huge, missing link between the people who loved movies, and now there's like my generation seems like is obsessed with video games.
Yeah, I don't think like the younger you get, the less they care about movies, which to me
Right.
is a huge generation gap difference.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not blaming anybody. I understand, like,
No.
if you're raised with playing video games, that's going to be what's, normal to you. And if you weren't, if you didn't grow up watching all these 80s and 90s movies, then yeah, it's going to be a different experience for you. But I don't know. I just, I don't want to see the art form go away or turn into something weird that's not movies. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, there's always a trade off, right? There was a lot of negatives to the older legacy Hollywood studio system, but there's also things that we're going to lose, that will be unfortunate. I'm glad to have podcasts and comedians and everybody being able to do podcasts, but I mean that's not the sum totality of like the arts. You know what I mean? I mean podcasts are great, but I mean they're not the highest art form. It's podcasts are really just the new talk radio, which is fine.
Hmm.
But humans want stories. They want Apocalypto and Indiana Jones and Star Wars. Like that's what humans like. They like stories, not just people yapping. And I'm not against people yapping. I do internet yapping all day long for a job, so it's
Yeah.
great. But you know, movies are just an amazing art form like no other art form.
No, I'm with you. This might sound like a vinyl hipster type of take, but I wonder if the digital, technology that has replaced that analog reality of what film was. I don't know how much reels are still involved in modern filmmaking, but if they are digitizing everything, I wonder how much that takes away from the quality and the effect of some of the films. I mean, obviously you can use SFX to make a film have a filter or what have you, but there's a certain quality to like these old lenses. I mean, that's why Kubrick went and helped NASA out so intensely just so he can film Bear Lyndon, which barely anyone even cares about now, I mean, right? And it's like it's kind of incredible to think that this camera technology was so vital to the process of this storytelling. Like there's a
Yeah,
real
and that's one of those trade-offs is,
yeah.
there's never going to be that look, and you can't really even reproduce it. But I mean, David Lynch talked about this too because he filmed Inland Empire on a small Sony digital cam,
Hmm.
and he loved the idea because for him it made it a lot easier than having to do everything with the older systems. So again, there's always trade-offs, there's always pros and cons. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know a whole lot about cameras and tech and all that, so I can't really speak to it. But um, it's kind of like old synthesizers. Like we went and spoke at a horror convention, and I did some stand up and stuff there, which was a lot of fun, some comedic stuff. And I gave a lecture, and we met Alan Howarth, who's he did a concert too. He did a live performance of all the 80s John Carpenter stuff. So he wrote all the 80s
Hmm.
John Carpenter music themes for like Prince of Darkness, They Live, The Thing, all those John Carpenter movies. And we were talking about synthesizers and sounds and all this, and we were talking about how like I mean, computers can mimic it, but I don't know. There's just something about like this, even old synthesizers, which you would think, well, but isn't that technological? Well, yeah, but like old Moogs and old synthesizers, like they have a unique sound that I'm not sure computers can really
Oh yeah.
replicate.
No, I'm with you 100%. I mean, you can even get into the occult realm of Led Zeppelin, doing enchantments over their master tapes, right? And then every single copy of it had that spell cast into it. I mean, I don't know how true that is. It might just be rumor, but was it Dave McGowan who wrote about that originally? Somebody wrote about that originally that there was
I don't know who the original. I mean, that's kind of been a story going around. I don't know who the original. Maybe Fritz Springmeier talked about it. I don't know.
Well, yeah, that's a reputable source, but interesting. Well, and on that note, getting out on the road and whatnot, it's a new year. Do you have anything planned for 2025? Anywhere that the audience can check you out or follow up with you? See you doing some stand up?
Well, every live event we do, we usually include some forms of me doing comedic stuff. That might be me doing my cringecore songs live. I usually make fun of the crowd quite a bit, so I do some crowd work and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, we always include that in there. But we do also lectures and talks and book signings and all that. Um, this last one that we did in Tampa was the only one that I have scheduled for this year. So no, there's not any upcoming live events. And the main reason I haven't planned any new live events for myself is because I'm trying to finish Esoteric Hollywood 3. And live events take a lot of planning and effort, and it's a lot of extra work. So I just haven't had the time to do the planning for a new live event. But probably when Esoteric Hollywood 3 gets complete, we'll schedule some more live events for sure.
Right on. Well, I look forward to Esoteric Hollywood 3. You said it should be out this year, in a couple months, indefinite release, but folks can look forward to that and follow up with you at Jay's Analysis. You're on YouTube, your own website. All that is linked in the description, and people can support you directly through your website and get access to premium content. Is there anything else that you'd like to plug or leave the audience with before we wrap up?
No, you can just subscribe to the site, or I got all my monetization and YouTube stuff back, so people can join on the YouTube channel as well to get members content. But yeah, there's all that, and then you can still get signed copies of the books at the website in the shop section of my website. Every book is signed, so you don't have to request it. And then every Friday, the fourth hour, Lord Voldemort.
Right on. Now, do you have any hope that YouTube is going to follow in Trump's lead, that maybe we'll see an end to this censorship that we've seen for so many years? I mean, there is this executive order that implies social media companies can't infringe on people's right to free speech, but then they also, I guess, have this loophole. We don't have a right to, you don't have a right to be platformed to a certain amount of people, right? That doesn't necessarily, conflate or infringe on your free speech if we don't platform you. So do you think YouTube is just going to continue business as usual, or do you have any hope for,
Good question.
change?
I mean, I think maybe they wanted to bring that. They wanted to. My first thought was maybe because of the TikTok ban when that happened, that maybe YouTube was thinking we'll lighten up and bring more people back. But then supposedly TikTok was just getting bought by some other thing. I don't know what's going on with that. So I don't know if that's why. I know that Sargon got remonetized. I got remonetized. So maybe they were just sort of loosening up. I don't know. I have no idea what's going to happen there. It's a good question.
Yeah, I hope it does. My channel has been spared to some extent. I am monetized, but several of my podcast episodes have been taken down. My interview with David Icke was hot lead molten fire. I published it and it immediately burned right through the internet and was deleted. So yeah, it's incredible what YouTube has done, but hopefully they bow to old Emperor Trump. I'm happy that he's at least changing some things, and
Yeah.
Maha too sounds good. I'm on board with that as well. So we'll
I'm
see
not
what
sure why
happens.
they remonetized me. I didn't expect it. I mean, I moved a lot of other maybe somewhat spicy podcasts that had been up that weren't even public. There was some that were just unlisted, and I thought maybe I should just remove some of those to some other platform. And then yeah, they remonetized me. I didn't expect it.
Well, I'm
So that
glad
was
to see
5
it.
years demonetized, and then they let me back. So
I'm glad to see it. You deserve the support, and yeah, I encourage you to do a follow up on the Spies of Hollywood. I think that's an excellent idea. You mentioned that at the
they do
beginning.
that. Yeah,
Yeah,
that would be a good book.
would Robert De Niro qualify, do you think, or is he just in the pedo camp?
Probably some of the characters like him would be in that possible category.
Yeah.
Right? We've got several that are definite spies. Julia Child, Sterling Hayden went to become a spy for the OSS. Jimmy Stewart spy for the FBI. Cary Grant spied for OSS in Hollywood. I mean, so you've got plenty of people who are definites, and then you've got a category of like very likely, like a Ben Affleck type of character, maybe a Robert De Niro in there. And we know they're at least working with the CIA. Angelina Jolie, they've at least worked with the CIA at a very high level on many, many, many films. So
Under
there's
the
a lot of
context
those that
of
are
training, yeah. Stunt
oh yeah,
training
exactly,
and
yeah.
research. Yeah.
Tom Cruise, maybe, yeah.
Yeah, wow. Well, I look forward to that. I definitely encourage you to write about that. I think that'd be a hit. And yeah, man, thank you for spending the time with us. Folks, follow up with Jay. He is very active on his YouTube channel, and I am anticipating another solid book in Esoteric Hollywood 3. So we're all looking forward to that, Jay. Good luck with the
Thank you, man.
final steps. And until next episode, thank you for listening, and immerse yourself in the moment wherever you are in the now.